Welcome to Anchored by the Word, the podcast ministry of Westlake Baptist Church in Manita, Virginia. With your host, Pastor Justin Likens.
Welcome in, everybody, to Anchored by the Word. Joining me once again is my wonderful wife, Diana. Hello, sweetheart.
Hey, good morning. I'm delighted to be joining you again for season number 2.
Man, it's so hard to believe that we've made it to season 2, but I'm really excited for what's to come, especially today. We're going to start kind of a fun series. This is our first summer together, and I hope this series is going to be interactive. So we want our audience on Facebook, on Instagram, wherever you're listening, we want you to interact with us as you can. But a few weeks ago, I asked our faithful audience, chime in. What is your favorite Bible verse? What's your favorite Bible story? And I'm very happy to say they are not letting us down. We've got some great verses that we're going to talk about over the next several weeks to months or so. And we're going to have a lot of fun doing this. So let me ask you, Diane, as we start, what's your favorite verse or your favorite story in the Bible?
Well, there's just so many amazing stories that I could pick from that I don't know that I could say just like this is the favorite one overall. But there is a verse that is my favorite, and it's resonated with me for a really long time. And that verse is Esther 4:14. And it says, "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish, and who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this."
You know, Esther is an amazing story of God's faithfulness. Our audience probably already knows this, but it's a story in which you don't see the name God appear, but you see God's fingerprints all over this story. So before we break it down, let me ask you, why is it your favorite?
That's a great question. I know that several people have heard that that's my favorite verse, and they're like, kind of don't get it. Why is that your favorite? But before I can share with you why this verse means so much to me, I have to share a story with you from my teenage years. At that time, I was a newer believer, and I was excited about God and all that He was doing in my life, and I wanted desperately to be used by Him. But I was also really scared of the responsibility that came with that. And one day in particular, my grandfather had been taken to the emergency room, and our family had all gathered, waiting in the waiting room to hear what the doctors had to say. And at the time that we were there, I saw this woman crying, and she was all by herself. And I just felt in my heart that God was telling me that I should go talk to her or try to comfort her in some way. But I rationalized in my mind why I shouldn't do it. That certainly I was misunderstanding what God was asking from me. I didn't know this woman. I didn't know what she was going through. So how could I help? I didn't know, maybe she didn't want to be bothered. Also, she was an adult, and here I was just a kid. What was I going to be able to do to help her? And it all boiled down to I was scared. And so for all of those reasons and plenty of others, I stayed in my seat, and I didn't ever engage with this hurting woman. And that scene haunted my life for so many years. I would often wonder what happened to her. I wondered, did she lose a loved one? What was she going through? Had she just heard the worst news of her life? But the biggest thing that I wondered was that this woman's last opportunity to hear the gospel, and because of my disobedience, she never heard the truth. And I really struggled with that feeling that not only had I failed this woman, but ultimately I had failed God. And it was a little while later that I came across this story of Esther, and particularly chapter 4, verse 14, that really helped me to work through the guilt and the shame that I had from that experience.
Yeah, I get it. As you were kind of recounting that story, there were several thoughts that were kind of going through my mind, but I'll share those in a little bit because I don't want to assume that our audience knows the story of Esther. I'm sure most of them do, but maybe there's some who have never read it. So before we dive into the text itself, let's kind of set the scene. Okay, so the southern kingdom of Israel is known as Judah. They had been in captivity for 70 years in a place called Babylon. God sent them there into captivity because they had broken their covenant with God over the course of many, many years. And God had sent prophet after prophet, but they just refused to listen. And so God sends them into captivity. But before he sent them into captivity, God told them two things. Number one, you're going to suffer. All the way back in Deuteronomy 28, God had said, if you obey me, then you'll be blessed. But if you don't, then you're going to have to deal with these consequences. And he had warned them of that over and over and over. So he told them what was coming. But God also said, I'm not done with you yet. So God knew what was going to happen. He knew they weren't going to obey. He knew he was going to send them into captivity, but he was going to use that captivity for a purpose. Well, let's fast forward 70 years. There's a Persian ruler by the name of Cyrus. He signs a decree that says any Jewish person that wants to go back to their homeland, they can do so. But as we see, not all of them did. We know they didn't because of the story of Esther. Esther and her uncle Mordecai, they were Jewish people living in the Persian Empire. But what fascinates me about this story is even though they stayed behind, we can see that God was faithful to his promise of taking care of his children. In fact, God had a purpose for Esther and Mordecai staying behind, even if they didn't know it at the time. You see, there was this evil man by the name of Haman who was very prideful. And when Mordecai didn't bow down to Haman like Haman thought he should, well, Haman decided, I'm going to get my revenge on Mordecai. But Haman's anger was so violent, so just visceral, that he didn't just want to get revenge on Mordecai. He wanted to wipe out the entire Jewish population living in this Persian empire. And so he goes and secures permission to eradicate the king's enemies. Of course, he lied to the king to get this permission, but the king gave it to him nevertheless. And once Mordecai finds out about Haman's plan, he goes to Esther. And he's encouraging her, really. Use your place of influence over your husband to save you and your people. So that's kind of the backdrop of what we have. And there's actually a dramatic conclusion to this story. And we'll get to that in just a little bit. But Diana, walk us through what's going on in and around that verse 14 that you like so much.
Well, I'll definitely do that. But I think one part that if people haven't heard anything else about the book of Esther, they've heard about the beauty pageant. And so the reason that Esther is in the place that she is in is because the king was looking for a new queen. And so he had held basically a beauty pageant, and Esther won that beauty pageant. And so she is the new queen of the kingdom. And in that time, if you wanted to go in and see the king, you couldn't just go. You had to be invited. And Esther had not been invited for quite some time. So when Mordecai tells Esther about Haman's plan to kill the Jews, Esther knows that she needs to speak to her husband. But if she goes into him on her own, he could kill her for not being invited first. So Esther's in a difficult place. She's being asked to stand up for her people in a way that could very easily have cost her her life. She was afraid, and she was wondering why God would want to use her. Why did she win this beauty contest when any number of other people could have won? But God chose her, and she didn't know the reason why. And so some of the feelings that Esther was having were similar to the feelings that I was having in the emergency room, except they were so much more dire. And the words of Mordecai were an encouragement to me, and I think they must have been to Esther as well. He reminded Esther that the privilege that she had been given was not something that she had earned or deserved. He was saying, we don't know why you won this beauty contest, but you did. And because you did, we know that it was God's plan. And this right here might be the very reason that God allowed you to be in this place at this time. And then he tells her, if you choose to disobey God's will, the Jews are still going to be saved. They're still going to be rescued. But you and your family are going to face the consequences of your disobedience. And this verse helped me to realize that when I was in the emergency room and I saw that woman, her salvation was never in my hands. God had offered me an opportunity to join him in his work, but I don't know exactly what that work was. She may have been a strong believer, and God may have used that situation to encourage me and grow me in my faith. Or she might have just completely dismissed me out of hand. She might have been like, I'm going through a personal time. I want to be left alone. She may have just needed a hug or some encouragement. But the bottom line is, I will never know what God intended for that moment because I chose disobedience. I chose fear over faith. However, if it was God's will that that woman hear the gospel, then I know that she did, because God is sovereign and his will is not dependent on my obedience. But the consequences of my disobedience are that I did not get the privilege of being a part of whatever he was doing in that day at that moment. And Esther 14 is a reminder to me that God created me with a purpose. My purpose is to know him and to make him known. But God is also sovereign over my day-to-day life. You know, I think we've all been there. Why am I stuck in this long grocery line when I have a million other things that I could be doing? Or our children participate in wrestling. Why am I stuck at this all-day tournament to watch them actually participate for maybe 5 minutes? But whatever God is doing, why he placed me where I am, I need to know that there is a reason for it. And if I know there's a reason for it, then I'll be looking for where he is already at work in that place and how he is inviting me to join him in it.
You know, as you were walking us through those events, and even the story that you shared earlier, there were several thoughts running through my head. I think one of them was a study that you and I had done at a previous church. The study's called Experiencing God by Henry Blackaby. And one of his lines in there is, find where God is working and join him there.
Right.
And I think that's kind of what you were getting at, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. I also think, back to something I said in a recent sermon, you know, we often feel like we've somehow let God down, but we need to realize that we're not holding God up. God is the sovereign, all-powerful God of this world. And so sometimes I think we put more stress on ourselves than we should. But I think we've all been there where you were. You know, God impressed upon us to do something, to say something. And for whatever reason, we either hesitated or we just simply didn't do it. You know, I can think of a few instances of that in my life as well. So, you know, you're not alone in that. You know, in those moments, that intense guilt comes and regret and all those things. And what we have to do is really confess it, right? I mean, it's a sin. If God is prompting us to do something, we need to obey it. So we need to confess that sin. We need to repent of it. But I think we also then need to talk about and ask the Holy Spirit, you know, help me be faithful the next time this happens.
Absolutely.
You know, and then the other thing that was coming to my mind was Job 42, verse 2, where he says, I know that you can do all things and that no purpose of yours can be thwarted. What a tremendous encouragement that God's will is going to be done no matter what.
That is such an encouragement. And I know I'm kind of going off topic here, but you know, I know coming up soon you're going to be doing verses taken out of context. And I know that one of them is going to be how I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. And just how Job 42:2 is just kind of the opposite of that. Instead of focusing on what I can do, it says, I know that you can do all things. And how powerful is that?
Absolutely. And you're right. We are going to do later, maybe in the summer or headed into the fall of this year, some of those verses that are commonly taken out of context. But, I'll leave that for when it's coming up there. But thank you for that setup. But it's right. You've heard me say this over and over. God's will has already factored in every dumb decision I'm going to make. And something else you said over and over was it is a privilege for us as God's children to participate in what he is doing. And so, we don't want to miss those opportunities. We want to be able to see God not only work in us, but then work through us as well.
Absolutely. And, I think of, raising children. When our children help us to accomplish a task, the pride that they feel in it, recently I've been helping the kids learn more about cooking. And when they get to share that food that they've cooked with other people and be like, I had a part in that, the pride that they have, how much more pride do we get when we see, an area that God is working and he allows us to be part of what he's doing? Like, God, let me be part of that. How awesome is that?
Absolutely. So let's go ahead. I said that the story of Esther, kind of has one of those climactic scenes and finishes. So let's just finish it out real quick. So, Esther does risk her life by going to her husband. She tells him, what Haman's planning on doing. She does it through a couple of banquets. Of course, the king is furious because Haman's going to kill his wife, and he deceived. Haman deceived the king in all of this. So here's the irony of that story. Leading up to the day that Haman was going to kill Mordecai, Haman has some gallows built, and he's going to hang Mordecai basically in the center of the city on those gallows. But God had a different plan. Instead of Mordecai being hung from those gallows, it was actually Haman who was hung on those gallows. I just think about, where Paul writes in Romans, beloved, don't seek revenge, right? So often, I think about Mordecai, like how angry would I have been if this guy was going to try to kill me and kill my family. But God says, you know what? It's okay. I've got this. So I love that story. I've preached through the book. It's probably, 4 or 5 years ago again, but maybe one day I'll do a study back through it. But Diana, let's briefly talk about some theological teachings that can be seen in the book of Esther.
Well, I think the first one that we can see is God's sovereignty. Everything in Esther's life looked out of control. From when she was taken from her uncle's house to participate in this beauty contest, to her winning the contest, to the period of time where her husband was not seeking her out. That had to be painful. And then the call for her to go to him and put her life on the line. Everything about that situation looked out of Esther's control, and it looked bleak for the Jewish people. But even though Esther couldn't see it, God was in control the entire time, and he already had it determined exactly how it was going to play out.
Absolutely. I'm reminded of something I saw Paul David Tripp write recently. He said, your life is not out of control, it's out of your control. And man, that is such a powerful statement right there, because we do often feel like life is out of control and things are coming at us faster than we can handle. But just because we're not in control doesn't mean that God isn't in control. So I think his sovereignty is huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know me, I'm all about songs, but I never know the author and I never know the title of the song. But there's one Christian song that says, "Your world's not falling apart, it's falling into place. Stop holding on and just be held."
Absolutely. I actually referenced that, I think, yesterday. And the title of the song is Just Be Held, and it is by Casting Crowns, just in case you're wondering. But yeah, you are my little songbird. We can say one little thing, and you've got a song for it. I love that about you, by the way. A second theological teaching that I think is present in the book of Esther is God's providence. And providence is simply the promise that God is always going to take care of his children. So because he's in control, because he's all powerful, he is also able to not only see what's coming, but provide what we need and when we need it. And so that's how those three attributes of God kind of go together, and we see them throughout Esther. So let's go ahead and let's finish this episode up by maybe giving a couple of takeaways. So Diana, I'll let you go first.
Okay, so whatever situation that you find yourself in, you really need to condition yourself to think, why does God have me right here, right now? We have to train our minds to be focused on God, because we are sinful people and our focus is often on ourselves, but we have to condition ourselves. Why does God have me in this place? And to remember that there is no such thing as a coincidence. So if God has me in this place, then there is a reason. So how can I serve God in my present circumstances, even if those circumstances are not circumstances that I would choose for myself?
Absolutely. It's a mindset shift. I think about what Paul writes in Colossians 3, where he says, set your mind on things above and not on things of the earth. And so it's a constant call to be in prayer. Of course, Paul says that in 1 Thessalonians, but also just to say, God, you have me where I'm at for a reason. Help me to see it. I would add a couple. The first one is we cannot be silent when we see injustice. Micah chapter 6, verse 8 says, He has told you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of you but to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with your God? God expects his children to live a just life because that's a reflection of his character. We often highlight his grace and his mercy, his love, his forgiveness. So often we overlook the fact that God is still just. And if going into the New Testament, it says that God is both just and the justifier. Because of our sin, God, his justice would demand payment. And that would mean that we would pay the price for our sin. But as an extension of his grace and mercy, God is also the justifier in that the payment that was due, Jesus paid for us. And so I think it is really important. And I know God's justice has been hijacked by the woke church and certainly by the liberal media. But we as Christians, we are still required by God to live a just life. And when we see injustice, we have to speak up. We have to do something. The second one I would say is we have to trust God. We may not see what God is doing in the moment, but he's always working his plan out for his glory and his children's good. We may not be where we want to be, but we're where God says we need to be. So just keep trusting God in all that you do. Know that He's got a plan and a purpose for it. And that's going to bring us to the end of this episode. It's going to wrap it up. Diana, as always, thank you for sharing your favorite verse and your story with us.
It was a privilege. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. I hope this has been encouraging for our audience. I hope it's going to challenge all of us to trust God and obey Him no matter what. So, again, thank you for joining us. If this has been an encouragement, would you do us a favor? Would you just share it wherever you're listening so that others could hear it and maybe be encouraged and challenged as well? And we'll see you here next week as we dive into another favorite Bible verse and learn together how we can live it out for God's glory.
This has been Anchored by the Word. Copyright 2025 to Westlake Baptist Church, 2075 Scruggs Road, Moneta, Virginia.